Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biollywood Podcast. In this series, we talk about biological threats and pop culture media that they appear in. I'm JT O'Brien, Research Principal at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and I'm here with the Commission's Executive Director, Dr. Asha M.
Hey.
I'm also joined here with the Commission's Policy Principal, Rob Bradley.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Anytime. Today, we will be discussing the 2023 HBO show, The Last of Us, which is based on a popular video game of the same name. And the show explores themes of survival, humanity, and the impact of a global pandemic, which is caused by a fungal infection. So The Last of Us is set in a post-apocalyptic world where a fungal infection known as the Cordyceps Brain Infection, or CBI, has decimated humanity. And the story follows Joel, who's a hardened survivor, and Ellie, who's a young girl who may hold the key to curing the infection. So together they navigate the dangers of this new world while also forming a deep bond. Spoiler alert, if you have not seen the show, we highly recommend you do so before continuing this podcast. This podcast will contain spoilers not only for the HBO show, but also for the game and potentially the second iteration of the game, depending on what Rob knows about that one.
We'll save that for the next step.
For the next one, yeah. For the second season, we'll save that. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think that I wanted to start with was the cold opens in those first two episodes. I thought that those were just brilliant. It was one of the best interpretations of infectious diseases that I think I've seen in film or motion picture, period. So I was just curious for your thoughts on what you thought about those two cold opens.
Well, I really liked the first one. Right off the bat, I thought it was great. Great way to open a brand new television show. Very typical of HBO to come out, guns blazing. I thought one of the things we address, and we'll talk about it in the ratings later on, is the portrayal.
Yeah.
It's hard. I know it's hard for actors who are not scientists to be portraying scientists. I did think that the first guy, was a little bit over the top in terms of scientific neutrality, if you will. Mm-hmm. He just was so blah and personalityless. But the second guy, which I'm sure was part of the point, you wanted to focus really on the fungus and on the virus. But he's a wonderful actor, and I thought he did a great job. And I went back and looked at it again just to watch it again. I didn't find anything strange or inaccurate about what he said. That could have been an interview with any of us on television, talking about fungus instead of viruses or bacteria or whatever. It's I just thought it was really, really, really well done. And I also thought it was very interesting that in that cold open, despite the fact that they're just being interviewed on television, you do get this increasing feeling of dread. Mm-hmm. I thought it was great. The guy who portrays the commentator, the interviewer, mm-hmm. He's getting more and more worried about it as we're watching it. So that's what I thought about the cold open, and I did think it was very. There were good points that were made mm-hmm. about fungi and what could possibly happen. I thought the science was good too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with those points, and this is my opportunity on this podcast to both express my great respect for John Hannah, the actor who talked about fungus in that first cold open scene, and all the work that he's done over the years. But also to give a lot of kudos to the Last of Us podcast, which involved the voice actor from the original game, mm-hmm. As well as the two executive producers of the show, and one of whom is Neil Druckmann, who actually produced and wrote the game itself. And going through preparing for this episode of our podcast, I went back and listened to all those episodes. And it was really insightful to hear about their thinking, both in the development of the original game as well as this show, episode by episode, kind of breaking it down. And what I thought was really notable about their discussion of this cold open is that the intent was to set aside our own recent experiences with COVID and with other diseases, because those are known quantities to a certain extent. Even though COVID was an unknown at the beginning, we are more comfortable with our understanding of its capabilities and our ability to combat it than we were 4 years ago. And what they wanted to do was basically say at the beginning of this show, set aside everything you think you know about biological threats. Here is something that's been out there the whole time, and just by the grace of God and nature, it has not actually been posed a threat to humanity yet.
Yeah.
And I think that is a genius way to approach storytelling, especially given the proximity of this show to something that impacted all of us across the world so recently, despite the fact that this show, or this game that the show is based on, predated the pandemic by 7 years.
But I think it was genius, too, because people are so tired of talking about COVID and talking about flu and talking about whatever. It successfully shifts your attention, as you said, like away from all this stuff that everybody's used to talking about and dealing with, to something that we're obviously not. And I also think, I mean, of course, it has to do with the game, but that there's no cure also gets rid of the whole argument about whether Operation Warp Speed was a good idea or not.
Yeah, and that kind of gets us into the second cold open, where I think the outbreak started in Jakarta, and there was this woman that they basically abducted. We're like, hey, we need you. And they're like, so this is what's happening. How fast can we get a vaccine? How fast can we get a treatment? And her answer is, there is no vaccine. There is no treatment. And he's like, so what do we do? She says, and she just says one word, which is bomb.
And interesting that there's no Indonesian word for bomb. It's the English word for bomb.
Oh, very impactful.
Very impactful, yeah. Like, it sends a message. She's like, bomb.
But it says something about us.
Yeah.
It certainly does. There's a universal expression for certain types of sentiments.
Yeah.
Again, I think that cold open served as a way to engage the audience with their own knowledge and experience, because that's where our mind immediately goes when we first think of a biological threat now. Well, where's how soon can we have the vaccine? Doesn't matter if it's COVID or Ebola or Zika or whatever. The thought is, okay, this is a threat. Let's just go cut to the chase. How do we get to a countermeasure? How do we get to the vaccine? And it's yet another way that the showrunners were able to set aside personal feelings and experiences and engagements with the diseases of today by saying, that's not even a consideration.
Yeah, but don't you think, there's one issue I took with this, and that was, of course, there's no vaccine because vaccines have to do with viruses, right? For the most part.
Or bacteria, yeah.
And some bacteria. But I understand the part about there's no cure right now. I understand the part that there's no vaccine for fungal infections. But we do have antifungal things that we could have at least tried. Now, maybe they did try, and that, we didn't see it in the cold open, and, they didn't explain that to her, or she assumed that was the case. But it just felt to me like there are antimicrobials, there are antifungals, there are So even if that stuff doesn't work, wouldn't you expect a place like USAMRIID or even a manufacturing facility to take the pre-existing antifungal and at least try and make it, there was, she was just like, okay, we all die. And that's it. We either die one way or die the other.
Because I think she knows. Why would anybody spend time on cordyceps? Why would a researcher spend time? Why would a researcher?
Can't we start now working?
We could, but it only affects insects right now. So
no, I mean, like in the show.
Yeah.
Couldn't they have, right at that point, she could have said, before, I don't know how much time we have, but let's work on an antifungal.
I think that there's a possibility that perhaps her mind was going to immediately, how do we respond to this right now? And a recognition, the horrified look on her face when she was examining the cadaver and realizing how rapidly this fungus was spreading throughout this individual and how rapidly the disease was moving from person to person. I think she knew what ultimately was realized within days, if not less, after she had this realization, which is that the world is going to fall immediately.
Yeah.
There is going to be no opportunity.
There's no time.
No 9 months to have operational warp speed for, based on existing antifungals or repurposing antifungals. The only way you can stop what's about to happen is to do what we do in the livestock realm quite frequently. Cordon off and cull the impacted population before it can take root. Now, as we find, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in our discussion, as we find out, even bombing major population centers really didn't actually stem the outbreak in a meaningful way. But I think there's a recognition on her part that if you want to deal with this now, and the only way to prevent civilization from collapsing in her mind was to take that extreme of a measure. I do think that there are allusions, particularly in episode 2, to efforts that were undertaken after Outbreak Day to develop countermeasures, and how they all have subsequently failed over the course of 20 years. So while there's no allusion mentioned to antifungal specifically, I have to imagine that was one of several routes that Fedra or some body or a scientific entity was trying to explore as the potential countermeasure, and it just didn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they probably tried, but I mean,
there just wasn't enough time.
Fungi get the least amount of funding compared to viruses and bacteria. That's already a small pot, so they get the least amount. The odds of there being something existing that could work on this, I think, are extremely low. And I think, to Rob's point, they didn't have the time.
Yeah.
You don't have the time because this was spreading so rapidly that you just did not have the time to develop something you had to cull or to bomb, or if there was any hope of stopping spread. I think you had to take
out the hosts.
You had to take those extreme measures.
I will say that this does remind me of why we made some of our own recommendations. When you look at the Strategic National Stockpile, for example, one of the things we complain about all the time is that we have so much emphasis on vaccines and not enough emphasis on all this other stuff.
Therapeutics, diagnostics.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I really don't think that we're doing a good enough job with our scenario-driven activities. Somebody should be sitting around and not just dreaming up, look at all the different ways the United States could be attacked, but it should be stuff like this too. This is not beyond the realm of reality. This is this could all we're talking even in the first cold open. John Hannah's character does say, we're so close in terms of mutation. And never mind that what's going on with humanity, he's pointing to climate change. We're not talking about a gigantic mutation.
Right.
Or
we're not talking about like a bird flu mutation to humans.
Yeah.
That's not even what he was talking. Like, I think you're right. He was talking about the climate aspect, because it would take more mutations for this to come to humans. But I mean, it does speak to a question that has to do with money.
How do you invest? How do you justify investing in creating countermeasures for something that doesn't exist yet, when we don't even have countermeasures for all the things that do exist? But the other side of that argument is this television show and the game. This is why you want to try.
It's a low probability of risk, but very high consequence.
Do you think that the recommendation we made about developing a vaccine for at least one virus in each of the viral families sort of applies in this case too? That somebody should be thinking like, well, we have cordyceps here on the planet right now. Maybe we should at least try to come up with a countermeasure for something in this family.
I think that it does apply. I mean, our recommendation is definitely more specific to viruses in particular, but I think you can apply that philosophy and that method to bacteria and fungi as well. Obviously, the thing we're most worried about is viruses because they're more common. But this is the kind of sleeper threat that people don't think about.
Well, I think we need to do some research and do a report and make some recommendations around this.
Yeah. So one thing, so Rob has played the game.
I don't claim to have finished the game, but I did play the game.
He did play the game. And there are some things that I think were different between the game and the TV show, particularly about things with how it's transmitted.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So let me just go into the two things that were glaringly different, and one is a matter of pacing, but I think that's just inherent with the different media, right? When you're a passive participant in media like a show or a movie, you want to kind of get right to the point. You don't want to be following somebody around doing a lot of things for a period of time without the action or the plot moving forward. So I think as a creative decision that was made was to remove a lot of encounters with infected that took place in the later parts of the game and later parts of the story. I don't know if you noticed this, but you see fewer and fewer of actual infected as the show goes on. Mm-hmm. That the last time you actually properly see infected that isn't in a flashback is in episode 6, or actually might even be episode 5. I think it's episode 6, where at the end of their encounter with Henry and Sam, when there's the big expulsion of infected coming out of the ground, that's actually the last time you properly see infected people, because then they're on to Tommy's compound, and from there on, the enemy is people. And that's all you see from there on out. Whereas in the game, you just continue to encounter infected individuals throughout the remainder of the
clickers and bloaters.
Clickers and bloaters.
So the enemy is actually us.
Yeah, which is not an uncommon sentiment. The Walking Dead, obviously, is one of the bigger properties that has espoused that. But I think what is done effectively about this is, as many stories that are told in post-apocalyptic terms, is they use the biological threat as a way to put people in uncomfortable situations to demonstrate how humanity responds to adversity. And as the executive producers themselves talk about in the podcast, that a lot of this is about what people are motivated to do because of the types of love they feel for others, whether it's for familial members of family, romantic partners, or as we see in the finale of this season, love of humanity. Mm-hmm. What motivates people and what tragedies and triumphs come from that is the intended message of the show. And because, and in the game too, but because of the nature of the show and the runtime, they don't focus as much on the biological threat as time went on. I was taking notes, for each episode, and I found myself taking fewer and fewer notes for the purposes of this podcast as I was going on, because much less of it had anything to do with the work that we do here. It was much more a tale of
character study.
It's a character study of these two individuals who are complete strangers at the beginning of this journey, and then become inseparable by the end, to the point where one is literally willing to sacrifice the rest of humanity to save them.
But in the game, do they portray the spread of the disease differently?
I feel like we find out less in the game. A lot of it, I think, is gleaned more from notes that you find as you go through environments. It's part of the interactive nature. One of the really cool things that I found with this show is that for the first time we were shown perspectives outside of Joel and Ellie, because that's all you are able to witness in the game.
Sure.
So the scene in Jakarta, the cold open of the last episode with Ellie's mother, Anna, that's all new. And in fact, that scene with Ellie's mother isn't even in the game. And so and same thing with Jakarta. None of this, it's all new material. And so I think that there's a lot more that's disclosed and discovered, I think, by the audience watching the show. It's kind of presented to you in a more upfront way than in the game, where you kind of have to piece things together based on clues that you find in the environment as you walk along. And I thought it was really fascinating to experience that way. But to your original question, JT, there is a very glaring difference in the game versus the show with regard to transmission. The game kind of embraces the notion of spores as a delivery mechanism for the disease as you move through, to the point where Joel is often putting on a gas mask to protect himself as he's walking through some of these environments. And obviously we don't see that at all in the show. And according to the executive producers, it was an intentional decision. I think that was made.
Well, where would he even get one?
Well, in the QZ is where he gets one in the game. And that's an intentional decision, I think, by the producers, one, so they didn't have to make the cast put on gas masks, but also because it's a little
less believable.
It's not just less believable, but
like if you're playing it, I think you can immerse yourself suspend disbelief enough. But if you're watching it,
I also
you're like, and there's
think-
these zones, right? Like, aren't there zones in the game?
I also think that Pedro Pascal, after The Mandalorian, said, I refuse to put something over all my face. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Tragic story of video game adaptation.
By the way, this is kind of ironic that this is the second, show based on a property that Pedro Pascal has been in that involves him escorting a young child.
Yeah, young child.
From point A to point B.
Just on his niche.
Yeah.
So I guess they wanted to differentiate it somehow. So no matter. But I think part of it is also, once you introduce the notion of spores as a delivery mechanism, it really complicates the storytelling, I think, for the viewer. It makes it less believable that perhaps you could get through a certain area without having gotten infected. It's less clean of an explanation versus what we saw in the show, which is that if you're bitten, then you're infected. That's how you get infected now.
Right.
And I think it was easier to tell the story they wanted to tell without having to introduce the muddiness that comes with, okay, well, how do we know that we didn't just walk through an infected area with a bunch of spores?
Right, because in reality, you wouldn't.
Exactly. We wouldn't see the spores. Unless everyone's walking around in PPE outside, there's just no way for them to know with any level of certainty.
Do we think that realistically these would be the only two methods of transmission? See, what I was wondering was, even like if you look at anthrax also sporulates. But you don't have to breathe in a spore in order to get anthrax. It doesn't have to be sporulated. You could just breathe in anthrax and you'll get the disease. So could that be the same? I just am not that familiar with fungi. But would this fungus have to sporulate in order to infect you?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it would have to sporulate, but I think most fungi do, and this one in particular does.
Okay.
So I think, it is possible that there could be spores that, you inhale. Or, there could be spores that are lethal enough to touch your skin. Probably.
Yeah, but...
And cause an infection.
Okay. We don't...
That's his point about the game, though. Like, if you introduce that into a show, it becomes less believable for the characters to succeed.
Yeah, because infection is around literally every corner.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy for the audience to understand threat level with their eyes the way that they can if they see an infected individual.
Got it.
Like in the episode where Ellie and Riley are in the mall, you know that the threat is there only when you see the infected individual around the corner.
Right.
For all we knew, the mall could have been filled with spores, and they were dead the second they walked in. Except not Ellie. But, so I think that just kind of makes it more difficult to tell the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it was a fine decision to make. I don't begrudge them for it.
I think it would have been an interesting. It could have perhaps sparked an interesting conversation about how much of a threat this sort of biological entity can be, if it ever gets to the point where it can inhabit, humans in this way or impact humans in this way. But understanding that wasn't the intent of this show, I also respect their creative decision there. One question I did have for the two of you, understanding that cordyceps clearly impacts certain animal species already, including ants, and most notably ants. What I thought was really fascinating was that there wasn't any indication in the show or in the game of infection of animals by cordyceps.
I think that's an amazing point that I had not thought about, but it would not jump from ants to humans. I don't think that's a natural spillover pathway. Like, obviously would have to get to a mammal somehow first before, right?
Well,
unless we were the first mammals.
This is sort of reminiscent of our question about what happened with COVID.
Yeah.
Did it start in one thing? Was there an intermediary animal before it came to us?
But there appears to be no hesitation by any human in this world to eat animals that they kill in the wild. No checking to make sure they weren't infected, nothing of that nature that would indicate to me that there's even a consideration that these animals could be infected.
Well, it is interesting. I would not say that it is common for, of course, now we're not talking about fungi again. Now we're back to talking about viruses. But it is not uncommon for microorganisms to only infect one or two.
Very specific.
Specific. This thing going on with current highly pathogenic avian influenza actually seems, at least in my experience, to be an exception. It's infecting all different, even just among avians, it's infecting all different kinds of avians that we don't usually see.
Right. I think it went from avians to mammals.
Right.
Like it's a slower burn
Right.
than something like Cordyceps in the show is, but I think it does represent a lot of the same.
Right. So, but look, I mean, maybe it does infect other animal hosts, but they're not animal hosts present in the United States. So maybe they're infecting, in the show, it infects monkeys, orangutans.
Yeah.
Or maybe the ants get picked up. I mean, if birds eat ants, I'm sure there are some species that do.
Perhaps, but
From the birds.
But nobody talks about ingestion
talk
as
about
a
the-
root of...
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, when you see the monkeys on the campus of, what was it, Colorado State University, they're I immediately assumed, I guess that's episode 6 perhaps, I immediately assumed that those monkeys were going to be infected and attack you. And instead,
Chekhov's monkey.
Instead, they're just there
Yeah.
the whole time, and they never actually prove to be a threat, and you never encounter any animals like that throughout. So that's not to say that, perhaps there's a version of cordyceps out somewhere else across the world that's impacting a certain type of animal species that we just don't see, but at least in the United States, the former United States, it doesn't appear to be even on the radar for anybody who's survived.
But also, in fairness, it started, and then we go forward in time, right, by 20 years. So it is possible, at least, that when it first started, people were maybe more hesitant. But now, you're eating things and whatever, and you realize it's not in the water, it's not in these animals that we're eating.
If it's not in the animals, that would make me think this was engineered. If it goes straight from ants to humans.
Well, especially the delivery mechanism being grain, apparently. It would have been food tampering with specific bioengineering.
It could have been, because I can't see a way where it goes from ants to humans like that. And with what you just said about the grain, I forgot about that.
Yeah, that's episode 3.
Yeah.
When they talk about that. I mean, granted, it's coming from a very unscientific perspective, but Joel is providing the only insight that we have into the delivery mechanism for this outbreak.
But now in this show, though, correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be confusing my shows, but isn't there a scene somewhere where people are eating people?
Yes, they're in episode, I think it was the second penultimate episode.
So isn't that an interesting thing? Like, wouldn't you be worried that if this fungus seems only to infect other human beings, I would think that you would want to avoid eating human beings. Just
Yeah,
in case.
You would think so. My assumption is they're checking the bodies for bite marks before they consume it.
Yeah, and I obviously when they cut it open, if there's
Well, if there's stuff coming in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
They cut open a body at one point and you just see cordyceps, right?
Yeah,
flowing out.
I think in Jakarta, she's cutting open skin, and even Ellie, when she finds the trapped infected in the bottom of that convenience store, she cuts open its head. You can see cordyceps. I think obviously there's the visual telltale, but I think that there is an understanding, acknowledgement by the populace that, okay, we know that it could be in a human, so they're probably automatically checking those bodies, the cannibals are anyway, before consuming them. But since there's just no reference made to the animals when they, kill the deer or otherwise hunt, rabbits or pheasants or other animals that we see that are hunted and consumed during the course of the show, they might be performing similar checks, but since we don't ever see any animals displaying signs of infection, it's tough to tell.
I think it's very interesting, and it raises the question of genetic specificity. Why just us? Why just humanity?
It's like smallpox. Why just us? It only really happens mostly in humans.
Yeah. Why? Are we such fabulous carriers?
We might be.
We're very appetizing to
We travel the world.
Yeah, but then that's us humanizing the virus, right? It doesn't know that we
It
travel.
doesn't need to be human to learn.
While
It's
we're
like
talking-
AI, it's just figuring it out.
While we're talking about unique or interesting elements of this particular disease, I did have a question for the two of you. In the same scene where Joel talks about the delivery mechanism for the or how the outbreak day started, because there was tainted cordyceps presumably in grains or in foods. I think this is episode 3. He also mentions and shows this. It's like a small little almost graveyard. Along the path where soldiers executed a bunch of people who were fleeing to quarantine zones around outbreak day. And and he mentions specifically, says that the dead cannot be infected. And that was the justification for them to kill these individuals rather than let them come into the QZ. He says there was no room. And my thought was, as I listened to that, that makes perfect sense for viruses. It makes perfect sense for bacteria, but fungus should be able to thrive, right?
Correct.
Even on dead tissue.
That would be my estimation, especially from the scenes we've seen from the show.
Yeah.
Where you have just cordyceps covering an entire field. Like there's the one where Ellie and Joel are overlooking this large patch of land, which I think is directly from the game, like that those exact mannerisms and everything, which is really cool. But they're looking over it, and you can just see the cordyceps are spread all throughout the grass and the environment.
Right.
Where if you step on it, it's going to set a pulse throughout the nervous system of the fungi. And
by the way, that was also exclusive to the show. That was not in the game.
that was not in the game.
That was not in the game. The notion that you step on a patch somewhere,
Gotcha.
the dozen folks over here will come running. They actually changed the end of episode 2, or the sequencing of what happens in episode 2. Originally, it was Fedra that storms the Boston State House looking for Ellie. At the end of episode 2, they have it be them, stepping on a piece of fungus, and it brought the runners coming.
Yeah.
So that was an original to that. But
So I would say, I'm not sure that something about this makes sense. If the fungus is in grain, then the fungus is thriving on something that's already dead. You've already threshed the grain, right? It's not up on stalks somewhere.
It could be in spore form, though, in which case it wouldn't have to. It might not have to eat.
It might not have to eat, which gets us back to what Rob is saying, which is why does it need, what does this fungus need to grow and or survive? If it's producing spores are not produced in their most favorite environment, right? Spores are produced when there's an environmental pressure, I thought, that makes something create a spore. It's trying to survive.
Right.
So it's creating something that has like a capsule around it or a wall around it so that it can survive until it gets to another place that would be more hospitable, and then the spore goes away and it grows as usual. So I mean, look, it might be that they decide that even if the fungus gets into the dead human,
it
it
nourish
doesn't
itself,
matter.
but the human won't, resuscitate and become a runner. And,
Right.
There's not a lot.
Yeah.
They won't become a threat, like an
Yeah.
active threat.
Yeah.
So like
Exactly,
it'll
an
just be
active
like a thing on the don't mean to dehumanize. It'll be just a thing on the ground that has fungus growing around it, like a rock,
Yeah.
Right.
or something like that. It's like
And it would
it's
be
a
limited.
stable threat. It's
And it
like
would be
known,
limited, right?
Yes.
Because it's not continuously pumping blood.
and it can't chase other people and further spread.
Yeah.
So I think, So on that note, Asha, I would like to ask for your opinions on the military.
Well, I think it's
And this.
interesting. I do think it's interesting. I know we talk about this a lot. I don't know if you guys noticed, but there are a variety of signs that are up throughout all this in the quarantine zones, which I think very accurately have been shortened to QZs. That sounds like militarism, right? Instead of DZs, drop zones, we have QZs, quarantine zones. But one of the signs said fight infection and insurrection,
Ooh, I didn't even notice that.
which I thought was fascinating. And, you're asking this question about the military and the military's role in dealing with insurrection. I think it was interesting in this show that the military, and again, we're talking about 2 decades, I guess, has swung all the way over to the point where they're controlling these QZs.
Do you think that goes like a coup?
And they're almost like they're like fiefdoms. They're like, it's even though they're all called Fedra across these different cities, they all appear to be in operating independently. There doesn't appear to be a higher chain of command because clearly the Kansas City QZ was draconian with what they were doing to their populace, whereas the Boston QZ doesn't seem to be treating its populace great, but it does not appear to be as heavy-handed.
Well, I don't think that's unrealistic in that communications clearly sort of fell apart here. So I don't know how people would be, going back and forth and getting direction from big DOD at the Pentagon, you know. And they might have tried for a while having runners and things go around. But it seems to me that what happened was the military would have resources, right? They would have weapons, they would have guns, not guns, they would have ammunition, they would have food, they would have all this stuff. I think that if you push people to the point where it's about survival, and you realize that military personnel are trained to say, hey, somebody's got to be in charge, and they have a belief in their own mission, they think they're doing something right here, in terms of keeping some kind of order. Plus, you have the pressure of this sort of ever-present disease sort of freaking everybody out. I think it's a possible outcome, the way it's portrayed. But I would not call what they're doing, military policy. Nobody would ever say, like, okay, if this happens, this is what you guys are going to do. I think it's just another reflection of society, and that part of society also falling apart.
And breaking down.
This is not what you should be doing. And I would also say, in the long run, they have maybe another 5 years of this nonsense because it's resource driven. Once the military runs out of whatever they have, then that's it. Why would anybody put up with this? Everybody, they'll rise up there and they won't be able to fight back. But what they show in the show is not, it is not how anybody is trained to be when they're in the military. But it is interesting that it happens apparently all across the United States.
Yeah.
And as you said, Rob, some are like over here somewhat reasonable. Others are over here doing things draconian. I think that reflects the nature of whoever is actually at the top
whoever is the CEO
of that military chain of command, and how they're flipping out and trying to deal with whatever is going on.
And what I think was fascinating, and this isn't necessarily related to the biodefense topic or mission, but the show really is trying to trade in shades of gray, right? People, it's not necessarily about whether you're right or wrong. It's about the motivations that go into the decisions you make. But I thought it was very fascinating to show that even though Fedra is absolutely portrayed as heavy-handed, euthanizing young children who come into the QZ who test positive for cordyceps, clearly rationing food, cutting side deals with smugglers, but they also show the flip side of what happens when you overthrow a Fedra, when the QZ is brought down, as we saw in Kansas City, where those who overthrow oppressive government aren't necessarily always any better fit to rule. And the result is that entire area is overrun with these infected who were not properly maintained the way that Fedra had been maintaining them up to that point. You also hear allusions to other QZs falling over the course of the years. The one episode we're probably not going to talk too much about, with Bill and Frank, beautiful episode, but Frank is fleeing from the Baltimore QZ, which had just recently fallen, trying to find his way, I presume, to the Boston QZ, and I think there's also allusions to Pittsburgh QC falling at some point. So you hear about these QZs falling over the period of time, and it's kind of left ambiguous as to what does that mean for the fate of the area, but it feels that it's less safe in general as a result.
Yeah, and also you wonder about comms. So I'm assuming that these QZs are not in constant real-time communication. I'm assuming that you hear about a QZ falling through rumor.
Well,
through human, maybe
In that first episode, the back half of the first episode, we do see Joel go to what appeared to be almost a radio station.
Oh, yeah.
A radio room.
Yeah.
Where they were sending and receiving messages, although clearly it's a backed up process.
Yeah.
You have to wait in line for who knows how long to send those signals, but it's very spotty from the sound, from the sound of it. I presume that the military or federal would have priority access to those comms channels versus civilians.
Well, but let me ask a question about that, because I thought that was interesting that we have a radio, apparently. But, okay. Where's the electricity coming for this?
That's a great question. They allude to in Jackson, was it Wyoming?
I think.
Where Tommy is living, that they're using the hydroelectric dam. They got that running again. So that makes a lot of sense.
So anywhere near a hydroelectric dam can go like 200 years without maintenance.
Yeah. So as long as
you're there,
But you're right. How is the Boston QZ getting?
Yeah, but how's the Boston QZ getting? They don't have hydroelectric dam.
Yeah, there's no. They never really settle that. And to your point, how do you keep communications? Both sides have to maintain power in order to keep that line of communication open.
Yeah.
So
and then why, if you can use radio for this, then why isn't the military, which is replete with radios? Everybody's got a radio. Why couldn't they be communicating better in that way? Also, it does beg the question about what happened to the satellites. What happened to all of that? I guess I just assumed after a while that it was just, you run out of batteries for your phones. You run out of stuff.
Well, I mean, remember the outbreak day was in 2003, so there wasn't thousands of satellites in orbit. There wasn't, the cell phones that were available at the time were much more simple than what we have today. I think someone made a joke that Return of the King hadn't yet released in theaters, so they never got to enjoy that that experience.
Yeah.
So I mean, you go back 20 years. Think about what
the
from a communications perspective, what they had. And it's very different than what we have today. I would also mention, just as a fun Easter egg, and if you look at the Jakarta scene, as they're walking through the hallways leading up to where the cadaver is, there's a sign for SARS on the wall because it's 2003. And that was a concern in the area at the time.
I did not notice that.
So you have to get used to looking at what's around, not just the focusing on the actual thing. There was one other military thing, though, that I kind of wish they had not done, just because we just seem to see it in so many of these TV shows and movies. The idea that, well, we have no choice. Let's go fire a bunch of bombs at everybody. And you see and you hear helicopters flying around and rockets being shot.
Yeah. Was this in regard to the insurgents or about the bombing that took place at the beginning of the outbreak?
At the bombing at the beginning of the outbreak. I don't think it's just in Jakarta either. I think we see it somewhere else too.
Yeah. So
there's just this military activity and people are, bombing stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly hope that we have more options than just toss bombs at people. I also wondered, if you're going to do that, why are we not dropping nuclear on something? I mean, not that that's a wonderful option either, and not that we would want to pepper the entire planet with nuclear weapons. It's not to say that it doesn't happen. I'm sure somebody decides, we can't do this. We're going to
radiate everything.
Yes, it will just deal with the radiation. But anyway, I'm not saying it's unrealistic. I just feel from a story perspective, we see it in Outbreak. We saw it in Hidden.
Yeah.
It's just over and over again. And it kind of sucks that seems to be
the go-to
option, even in the land of fiction.
Yeah. Well, I guess even when you're telling a fictional tale, you're trying to establish stakes. You're trying to establish stakes and level set for the audience, and that's something the audience can understand very quickly. That things were so serious that you had to take it to, we're bombing everything. I do think from a storytelling perspective, it's fascinating as they're walking through the downtown Boston area, that they talk about the fact that, I think Ellie says it looks like the surface of the moon.
Yeah.
And they said that they bombed across the entire city to stem the spread of the infection, and that it was more successful in Boston than it was in other cities. makes you wonder, if they hadn't done that, would they have been able to truly set up a QZ just outside the city the way that they did here? And if you were using nukes instead of conventional bombs, how much of the United States would be uninhabitable after you were done? Even, let's assume you're successful and you stop the infection. Now you've irradiated a good portion of the country.
Yeah.
Do you think that napalm would have worked?
Maybe. That's a good question.
I think it would be similarly destructive to.
What about fire? I mean, we're talking about fungus, right?
We can't.
Well, in the game, fire is very effective against the infected, including the bloaters. You're throwing a Molotov cocktail apparently does quite a bit of damage and really burns them. So there's a good question of if we had done. I mean, firebombing would have been the most clean way to deal with this, and it's still possibly one of the most destructive ways to attack one's enemy short of a nuclear bomb. It also requires a tremendous amount of military investment.
But we do have incendiary weapons.
We do.
We do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think like napalm could work, but I mean, how long does napalm burn for after it's? How many days? How long before you can? How long before you can reoccupy the area?
And it's
Well, do you even want to reoccupy the area?
Well, that goes to Rob's point about nuclear weapons.
Again, I mean, firebombing or napalm, you're making a smaller area uninhabitable, right?
Right.
So but again, it gets to the larger point of this discussion, which is when you're faced with such an extreme biological threat and you're talking about these sorts of solutions, that really just I think goes to how dangerous this whole thing can be.
And also, you made the point earlier, and I think it's fair, that there's only so much time. The whole world goes down in a few days. So
right. So you're making split second
right, split second decisions. And if you're like, well, okay, let's give it another day before we decide that we're going to use napalm or an incendiary device or whatever it is, they would not have realized that they just burned 25% of their life waiting to get more data, waiting to get more information, which they would wait to get more information. At least somebody would.
Yeah.
So that is what I think.
It comes down to the individual, I think.
I am a little surprised that society does not become more militaristic. In what we see is more like there's the military at these QZs, just sort of like in control, but everybody else is like put down by the military. They're not, as a society, everybody becoming militaristic. It's us and us versus them.
That's the rugged individualist spirit of the United States.
I guess.
maybe if we saw how things were going over in Asia, it might be different. The response might have been different.
And I would have liked to have seen, and maybe we see it in the game, but like what happens at a place like a really big place like Northcom? What happens? In any of those commands? But Northcom here in the United States, since we have it, that's one. And then what happens? Is there any place on Earth that is not affected by the fungus? Are the naval carriers okay floating around on the ocean? There's a whole show about that where they're okay.
Yeah.
Does Antarctica get infected with this fungus too? It's possible because it's clearly able to survive in the extremes, at least with its spores. Is it out in the middle of the desert? Is it?
Yeah, those are great questions.
In Hawaii?
Unfortunately, I don't think the show or the game does a good job of answering those yet. I mean, we'll see with part 2 and with season 2 if that changes.
I suggest, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but I suggest, especially with the cold open from the very beginning, we talk about the impact of temperature.
Yeah, that's huge.
I suggest that this is probably not in the high parts of Canada and Alaska. It's not in Antarctica. It's not in the worst, hottest deserts in the world. It's probably not in the middle of Australia, unless humans bring it.
Right, and then it has the opportunity to adapt. And one of the interesting things about real life cordyceps infections, they tend to survive and proliferate around in cooler temperatures. in much cooler temperatures. So like it would have to, like in order to infect humans, it would have to evolve to survive at human body temperature, like 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 C. So it could survive in colder temperatures, but I think it has to get to that point where it can survive in higher, hotter temperatures. That's when it would become.
Well, and I think that's obviously the scenario that plays out in the show. Game. And therefore, since it has changed in such a meaningful way, there's other elements of it that you can kind of hand wave away as, oh, well, it's part of the mutation. So for instance, the notion that, in cordyceps and ants kind of directs the ant just to seek out a cool place where it can proliferate.
Right.
Whereas clearly in
this, it's an aggression.
It's a much more aggressive sort of infection, and it's driving its host to proliferate by virtue of attacking and biting other potential hosts.
Rather than just dropping spores. Like it is in real life.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the many mutations. I think I tracked like 7 that it would take to come to humans. So it's not a likely thing that this will
Fingers crossed.
It's not likely that it'll come to humans. One other thing that I really wanted to touch on was the character of Ellie. She's kind of the star of the show, other than Pedro Pascal, but she is the main driver, I think, for the plot. She has immunity to this, and the whole show, and I'm assuming the game as well, is focused on getting her to a place where they can do research on her. But the question is, what does that research entail? Are they going to have to kill her to get the information that they need? Are they going to have to cut her brain open?
Well, okay, I would like to talk about that in particular.
Yeah.
If she has immunity, it did not make sense that Joel would be upset at the notion of what would happen to her because he's afraid they're going to go into her brain. Why would they go into her brain? It's not in her brain.
Well,
it's not in her brain.
They say it's in her brain in the show.
But I'm saying it should not be in her brain. If she's immune, she's immune.
She might just have a low level of cordyceps in her brain.
Well, so
otherwise, it's not immunity. It's a symbiotic parasitic infection, in which case, it is sitting there inside, and she's just learned to somehow live with it. But that's not immunity. That's symbiosis.
That's a great point. So the show and the game, and before I go any more into this, I should make a point of saying that I mentioned the changes from the game before, but I didn't do enough to give credit to how much of the game is almost replicated precisely in the show. I mean, some of the shots, some of the scenes, the dialogue are almost verbatim
identical. It's the best video game adaptation.
Yeah, just in terms of its accuracy and adherence to the source material. And I think part of the credit is given to the fact that they created the game with a cinematic feel to it, to the point where you've got directors and cinematographers shooting things almost the exact same way in some cases. So there's that piece, and that includes the scene near the end of the show, or the end of the episode 9 of the first season, where they kind of confront Joel with what they're about to do to Ellie in the hospital, and it plays out very similar in both media. But the gist of it is essentially that, well, it's actually there is one difference between the two. In the game, they just outright say that she has a mutated form of cordyceps on her brain. So she's not immune, to your point, but it's somehow mutated because of her body. So it's not that she has an immunity. She has an immunity to the symptoms of the cordyceps, but not to the growth of the cordyceps within her body.
Okay.
It's there, but it never presented the other elements of cordyceps infection, like kind of
controlling the brain.
Doesn't grow across the brain and start to control the brain. It doesn't physiologically change her in any other way. But they even say, if you find a voice recorder in the game, they even acknowledge that when they extracted blood, they were able to grow fungus. The fungus was growing out of the blood when they cultured it. So it's in her.
So
but it's not. But it's somehow kept in check
by
her body physiology.
Yeah.
But that would make it, when we talk about viruses, we talk about successful and unsuccessful viruses. Ebola, for example, is an unsuccessful virus because it kills the host. And so it kills the host. You don't want that. That's not a successful virus. that, if it kills the host, it can't go anywhere, it can't do anything. Our concern about Ebola then things like Ebola, is that it's going to mutate to the point that it doesn't kill the host, but maintains or creates a new kind of transmission that doesn't require exploding out of somebody's body.
Yeah.
But so in this case, if that's what they're showing in the game, you could make the argument that in the game, inside her, the fungus has become a more successful fungus. Otherwise, it was just like eating everybody up from the inside.
Yeah, can she spread it?
Well, so that's the question, right? They never, the way the storytelling unfolds, they never get to a point in the first game where they can demonstrate that. She bites David at the Hunter's Lodge in episode 8, but we never, and also in the game, but we never get to a point where we could see whether or not an infection would have taken hold.
Gotcha.
And so there's never been any other circumstance in which we know one way or the other if she could in fact infect people based on the story that's laid out in the game. But it is interesting that that's the approach that they took.
Yeah.
And is it possible too that you can carry an infection? We all can carry infections, and so in fact, many of us do carry infections. And what happens when you have an infection like that? It's just there. It's not dormant, but your immune system is effectively fighting the infection, and you just sort of have it. Lots of people have sinus infections, for example. It's just there all the time. If your immunity goes down, if you get really, really tired, if your nutrition is bad, then it's not that, suddenly you have the bacteria that causes a sinus infection. It's always been there, just sitting there being fought by your immune system. So it does make me wonder with her, is she just, or maybe it's her immune system it's not that she has immunity the way we consider it, but her immune system is supercharged. So it's just fighting and fighting and fighting, and the fungus is reacting to that. And it just never gets, it just never gets to proliferate.
Very possibly. I mean, the explanations given by Marlene in the hospital in the game is that it's a mutated form of the cordyceps, which could imply either that it was a random mutation happenstance, or that her body and her immune system altered the cordyceps in some way, shape, or form as part of the infection process.
We can pose the question, what's mutated?
Weird.
Is it the fungus, or is it something about her?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And
she might have a genetic mutation, in other words.
So I think that speaks to the complexity of this issue and why they might be inclined to cut her open.
Well, and so I do want to stay on this point for a minute that in the game they say, well, cordyceps is in her brain and it's mutated, so we've decided that we have to extract it, and we think we can turn what we learn from that into a vaccine, is the way they present it in the game. And obviously the extraction process would presumably kill Ellie, at least that's what's implied. In the show, though, a different explanation is given, both in that scene in the hospital with Marlene, but also at the beginning of the episode with the scene with Ellie and her mother, Anna, played by Ashley Johnson, who was the original voice actress for Ellie in the game. Kind of bringing her full circle as a maternal figure for this character. In that scene, she's bitten by infected before she's able to cut the umbilical cord, connecting her to her daughter. And the implication is that essentially bestowed upon Ellie cordyceps right at that moment that grew with her throughout her life.
Almost like an inoculation.
And so as Marlene's talking to Joel in the hospital at the end, she's saying that she's got a version of cordyceps in her body that is different and somehow kind of symbiotic with her, and that there's a chemical, I believe they said it was a chemical receptor or something that has prevented its growth within her, and that what they want to do is get that and replicate it so they can give it to the rest, because basically what this chemical is telling the cordyceps is that she's already cordyceps, so it doesn't need to grow anymore. So instead of a vaccine, what they want to do is replicate this and administer it to all humans, so that all humans will be viewed as cordyceps by the cordyceps infection.
Fascinating.
So it's
therapeutic almost.
It's almost like a therapeutic. So it's very different. Obviously when we talk about media, they throw the words like vaccines and therapeutics and stuff like they kind of throw them around interchangeably, but we look at this and we go, these are two very different situations.
Yeah, one is not a vaccine.
One is not a vaccine.
It's
at
like
all.
HIV medication versus HIV vaccine.
Why they have to go all the way into her brain to get this?
For the drama. Obviously.
Yeah, so they can like.
Okay, all right. That's
But I think it's interesting that's the scenario that's presented, and I think you might have alluded to this earlier. It is kind of interesting that it never crossed Joel's mind that whatever process they would need to utilize to leverage Ellie's immunity might result in her death. That it was always going to be draw some blood and figure out.
Honestly, that's what I would have
vaccine.
But in perspective, I would have been like, yeah, you just draw some blood and you could probably figure it out from that.
But
there are
when it comes
specimens
to
you could get from a human body.
I guess.
But no, like
they're
we're thinking
only
like, it's a
down-
dystopia. People are
Yeah.
desperate.
yeah,
They're probably not just taking your blood.
well, I mean,
But I disagree. Just in that if they kill her,
Then they're
that's
done.
it.
yeah, it's a one and none sort of thing. You'd rather preserve the
It
test
doesn't-
subject.
This part does not make.
Well, yeah, you would
Entire
start by
sense
drawing
to me.
blood, then maybe take tissue samples. You would work your way up to
Yeah.
cutting open the brain. You
Yeah.
wouldn't just, okay,
Even
here
if
we
you did
go.
cut open the brain, that doesn't mean that you have to kill the
Kill them,
person.
yeah.
We do brain surgery on people all the time, but it might change.
But if it's
her.
in like the frontal cortex or something and they need to get
Yeah.
in there, then
Well, let's talk about that for a brief second. Probably this fungus, aside from the whatever they're called, the clickers, where it comes out and basically the fungus becomes their whole head. It seems to me to affect two parts of the brain significantly. One is the frontal cortex, right? It's directing executive function. But the other is like the amygdala or something.
yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So you can, people, if you don't have to take out the whole frontal cortex, or you could take out part of the frontal cortex and still have frontal cortex available for executive function. I don't know what happens if you remove the entire amygdala.
I have no
I think
idea.
you can.
I think you can, but it's going to have long lasting.
Yeah.
Either one, if you take a piece out, it's going to.
Yeah.
Have an
Wait, do they have anesthesia and stuff? Like, what do we do?
Well, yeah, no, probably not.
Well, she was under some drugs. At the very end, after Joel shoots Marlene and drives away with her, as she's waking up in the car, he goes, "You're gonna feel woozy. The drugs are wearing off." So they put her under in some way, shape, or
Yeah.
for the procedure. I will say about that last scene, it is about the closest as you'll get to any scene in this show that emulates the video game. The scene where Pedro Pascal is just walking through the hallways, exterminating with extreme prejudice anyone coming in. It's basically it's almost like they lifted that from the video game, I think, to give a flavor.
Yeah.
Is that how it ends? Is you're playing as Joel and you're just walking through?
And you're killing all these fireflies who are trying to stop him from getting to. I mean, even to the point, they replicate it to the point where he walks into that operating room and the doctor goes, "I can't let you leave," and he picks up the scalpel, and Joel just guns him down and takes her. And the confrontation with Marley in the parking garage is exactly the same. And the scene, the very last scene of the episode, is almost verbatim from the game, and down to. The last word being uttered is Ellie going, "Okay," when Joel promises when he swears that what he told her is right. And then it cuts to black in both cases. So it's very, very similar. I did have a question for you, kind of taking a step back to the world building piece. Aside from the infection that Joel suffers after he gets stabbed in the abdomen with the end of the baseball bat, there's no indication of other infectious disease being present in this post-apocalyptic world. Did you guys pick up on that?
I didn't notice it. I do remember like when he suffered that injury, I was like, "There's no shot. There's no shot somebody would survive that." I think in an apocalyptic environment,
Especially when you're in a dingy basement without any medical treatment.
without any medical treatment, they don't have antibiotics. I might be remembering this incorrectly, but they have some like weird homemade medicine.
What they gave her was penicillin. Yeah, David and
Which could have been helpful.
Which was it was 2003.
Yeah.
The bacteria haven't gotten
Well,
that.
I would
MDR
say
yet.
that it does happen where there's a dominant disease that seems to push all the other stuff like out of the way. And your bodies are so busy fighting one thing that the others just don't have a chance to get in around.
Do you think that precludes the emergence of new novel diseases like bird flu, which wasn't really a thing in 2003? Do you think that would have, or could that have arisen, or a SARS virus or anything like that, or is it that humanity has just been so decimated by cordyceps that there really isn't opportunity for these other threats to thrive?
Well, it's also possible that if you get an infection, so there are cases where you get an infection with one thing and you could be exposed to something else. It should infect you and it just doesn't.
And that might be one outcompeting the other. But in some cases, you can get a co-infection where you have both.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the question is if you get cordyceps, you're gone pretty quickly. And we haven't gone into much about the incubation period.
The way it presents cordyceps is it's like it's taking over your entire body. It's growing absolutely everywhere. So maybe it's not that viruses that are circulating would not be there, would not infect. It's just that they don't infect and kill fungus.
Sure,
right?
But for those who are still healthy, though, especially when they're jam packed in these QZs, I just wonder.
We're back to immunity, though.
After Joel getting stabbed with a rusty.
But I think we're back to immunity. Why is she? She doesn't have to be the only person who somehow has supercharged immunity. It's just that she's got supercharged immunity, we think, to this fungus. I would say, at one of the first two episodes, I think, where they're burning the bodies, all they're doing is they have they have material over the mouths, and they don't even bother. I think the woman that would test it at one point just pulls it down. She's like, ugh. So it makes sense to me that humanity's response, it would be to develop immunity or develop something against all of this. But how would you know? It's not like you're giving blood specimens anywhere for anybody to be monitoring this.
Right.
One thing I think is incredibly realistic and sadly is about the same as what we have right now is that there's no biosurveillance other than blatant, oh my God, you're running around like a crazy person.
Yeah. Well, I was actually going to pose as a follow-up question. I didn't see any ability really by Fedra or anyone else to detect, diagnose, or develop countermeasures to anything that wasn't cordyceps.
Yeah.
We see pretty early on that they have these up or down scanners that they can use to decide if someone has cordyceps, which in some ways I almost question if that's better than some of what we have available to us when it comes to disease.
I think it is.
Now, handheld detectors, I think is
they move quick.
But is it detecting cordyceps, or is it? I thought those were just temperature scanners.
No,
they look like temperature scanners.
They look like temperature scanners, but I believe it was specific to cordyceps was the infection. Because if you think about it, Ellie should not present any higher temperature,
right?
But she should still test positive,
and yet she's still positive at the end of the episode 1.
But I don't know. This is technology that makes no sense.
But for me, it immediately made me think of all of those work we've done in biodetection and thinking about all what's going on BioWatch. And
it's a point of care.
It's a point of care. Even if it was just for a singular disease, to have something that it was that quick up or down, and you have this disease. What I also thought was really fascinating was not just that they seemingly have better biodetection technology in a society that effectively ended 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But that they were able to train dogs to detect infection.
Now that is completely realistic. We can train dogs today to detect infections. They can only detect one, though. Like you can train a dog to one.
Cancer specific or COVID specific,
cancer, so not
flu specific or bomb specific.
So we can do that.
That's really
make sense to me in the future.
Yeah, that was very, very savvy of them then to do that. But again,
what I would have done.
But again, it makes me wonder why the dog didn't detect the cordyceps in Ellie.
The dog should have.
The dog should have.
Yeah. Unless she's got a type of cordyceps that's so different that doesn't smell the same.
It doesn't smell the same. Interesting.
Yeah, or doesn't affect the person in such a way
That they're
that
exhibiting.
they're exuding something.
A smell that would have been associated,
Correct.
perhaps not with the actual presence of the cordyceps brain, but elsewhere in the body.
Right.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So is there anything else you guys wanted to cover quickly before we get to the ratings?
A fun fact that I happened to come across in the podcast for the show is that they, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but apparently penicillin was derived from a fungus, and they were pretty proud of themselves for introducing a countermeasure for the infection that was derived from fungus to demonstrate the duality of fungus as a entity in the biological threat arena. I also just would mention that while it's not shown in the series, and it might actually be shown probably in season 2 or The Last of Us Part 2, Joel does eventually admit to Tommy what he did in the Firefly Hospital, and I just wanted to add that for additional context about the guilt that he's clearly feeling from the decision that he made, despite the fact that he would probably do it all again if he could. But that I just wanted to mention that for the purposes of the story that this show and this game that I think told so effectively, using biological threats as the background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would only add that one thing I think they go to an extreme to demonstrate is that a disease event could occur and sweep the world in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And that means that we do not have days, weeks, months, years, decades to do attribution. We got to figure out what the source is.
Right.
We got to figure out what's going on, like ASAP. We do not invest enough in attribution. And we seem to be just sort of okay with, well, as science develops, we'll eventually get there.
Where it came from. Yeah.
And I don't want to say that everybody's okay with that, but I think this shows why we need to be moving faster and why we need pre-existing diagnostics and why we need people who are trained to be disease detectives, why we need PPE, why we need indoor air quality. If everybody had some super awesome indoor air quality, that would work against this. We don't know that with the spores.
Yeah.
I don't know what size they're supposed to be, in the show or in the game, but think about that. I mean, at least you would have some mitigation for a little while, buying yourself some more time.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a real weakness.
I think it is too. I think it speaks to our slow walking the bird flu response.
Yeah.
Like imagine if bird flu was like cordyceps, we'd be done. But because bird flu is kind of slow walking, like it's going to get there eventually. I think we all agree it will get to that point. It's just taking longer. So it's almost like the boiling frog in the pot.
Yeah, but
Type of
But there's so many factors, JT. When we talk about this stuff, yes, I expect you expect that it will eventually get to the point where it will jump to human beings.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be horrible, terrible influenza by the time it gets to us.
Exactly. It might not be
a successful virus. It should not do that.
Right. It will not be explosive. It'll be a slow burn.
Yeah.
I think that's the worry. I think that we should pay attention to. We shouldn't always expect a biological event to be explosive like COVID was.
Right. Also, I think we have to be looking at things a little bit differently. Your point is a good one in that we have highly pathogenic avian influenza first in avians and a lot of different kinds of avians, and then now we moved into mammals, and we expect, or we at least should be planning for, the eventual move to human beings. There's another timeline here that we could be on in terms of investing in research and investing in diagnostics and investing in the science and in the technology, and we can go the other direction too. I know certain appointees are very much into immune systems and all of that. Well, we can optimize those things too, but I think we have to have that concept in our minds so that we may be running a race that we should be thinking we are running a race with a disease, and we should be trying with this time to hurry up and do some of these things without the pressure of a worldwide pandemic that suddenly has us shut down.
Yeah, right. And I would just add to that I think that if nothing else, shows and media like The Last of Us and The Walking Dead and other properties that we may or may not talk about on this podcast demonstrate that we can't afford to wait until the infection has broken out.
It's too late.
It's too late.
And
that's the point where they say bomb.
And exactly, where they say bomb and where it's a massive question mark about what sort of infrastructure capability we'll have to address the threat in the long, medium, or short term. And I think we should heed the warnings that our own culture is trying to share.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay.
All right.
Let's rate
ratings.
Let's rate it.
Okay, so the first category on a scale from 1 to 5 is the relevance to commission recommendations. I think I give it at least a 4.
I gave it a 5.
I would give it a 5. I think.
All right.
Let me just say, I think it covers almost the totality.
Pretty much everything, right? Like detection,
Except maybe not mitigation, because you can never get to the point where you can.
It's not. Mitigation is bomb. That's the one side from that.
But I think it covers the entire continuum of biodefense that we talk about. So
Well, maybe not intel.
I guess not intel because it happens so quickly.
Yeah.
Well, there are these different factions who are operating with intel, being like, "Oh, Ellie has the immunity. We have."
Well, maybe
that's-
actually we don't know. We don't know
that's
what all
after.
is going
It's human
on here.
intel,
There is the question of whether this was weaponized in the first place.
Here's a good point. And you mentioned attribution alongside of that is intelligence. Even after Outbreak Day, there's a value in obtaining biological intelligence about the threat.
Yeah.
So
I don't know, JT. What do you think? You're going to change your 4 to a 5, or
Yeah, no, I'm gonna change it to a 5.
Okay.
I think it covers most of the full beat.
Okay.
Cover as the commission. So the next category is scientific accuracy. I am inclined to give this possibly a 4.5. I know they extended some of the scientific realism, but I think they did it in an appropriate way, which I really appreciated. And with the cold opens, I think those are some of the most accurate depictions of what a realistic situation might look like on a panel like that. That could have been a panel that we were having as the commission on the first cold open.
Yeah.
The second one with the woman in Jakarta, that could have been, somebody high up in, in government who deals with these things. So I think it was, I did not have any disbelief in any of the actors who were pretending or who were acting as scientists.
I gave it a 4. I could go to a 4.5. I would not give it a perfect 5, only because I just don't believe that scientists, no matter how desperate they are, would take Ellie and do so much surgery on her that she would die. They need she's more precious to them alive.
Just based on the logical.
I just don't think. I just think they may want.
They
to.
might torture her though.
I know what I'm saying, but so I took a little. I'm shaving something off for that.
For me, I'm not, again, I'm not the expert when it comes to the scientific accuracy of this, but what I would say is I'm probably at best a 4, maybe even a 3.5, because removing the spore as a infection mechanism really kind of
it does
it lessens the nature of the threat and the randomness of it. The fact that think about it from a psychological perspective, living in a world in which you literally cannot see death.
True.
And it's around every corner. I just feel like for me, I'm almost at a 3.5, to be honest. Between that, the whole thing with Ellie, and the immunity that doesn't make much sense from a scientific perspective.
I say let's give it a 4. Let's give it a 4. Just because I think because we don't. Part of what's going on here is we don't have all the information.
Yeah.
We don't know. Maybe the spores are flying around all over the place, but the remaining humanity has developed immunity, and we wouldn't know because nobody's doing any clinical specimens and testing on that. We don't know what's really happening entirely.
I suppose. I would be surprised if so much of humanity would develop an immunity to spores in a 5-year period. Well, it would have happened much sooner, right? It would have happened probably because there would have been some reference made to spores being an infection mechanism early in the outbreak.
Right.
If the immunity had to develop over time.
I don't know. What do you think, JT? You think we should go down to 3 375. Do we do quarter points?
We haven't done quarter points before. But I do take
What
Ralph's.
do you think?
I do take
3.5.
Ralph's point.
Then maybe we should go to 3.5. Let's go to 3.5.
Because I don't think the point of the show was to be perfectly accurate with the science. I think
No,
it
it wasn't.
It was to be a science adjacent, in my opinion,
Right.
to tell a story. And I don't think it's any criticism of the show as a product.
Yeah.
That they intentionally chose not to be
Okay.
completely
I'm
adherent.
convinced. I think it should be a 3.5.
All right. Can we do a quarter point? 3.7.
It's up to
I want to give them the points for the
Okay, nothing says. He started out with that whole point to have, so let's do 3.75.
All right,
It's okay.
3.75.
Okay.
The next category is scenario development. I think this is a 5.
I give it a 5.
I think it's a 5. I think
Fungus is like
the fungus among us, right?
fungus among us, yeah.
And not just the use of fungus as the threat, which is novel relative to other media that's out there, but food as a delivery mechanism, which we also don't see nearly enough, I think is a great way to set the scene and then to show a version of dystopia America that is absolutely dystopian and apocalyptic, but also not entirely without hope and little moments of joy, which is different than what we see in the Hunger Games or the Walking Dead, where it feels like those are much more fleeting.
Right.
And
Yeah.
in this world where it feels like you can have a whole city like Jackson that
Right.
isn't periodically inundated with zombies like on The Walking Dead.
Right. Or like the third episode, which was, as far as I know, not part of the games at all. But
The stuff with Bill and Frank, you mean?
Yeah,
but it was
brand new.
considered one of the best episodes.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely
Season, you do get to see those moments of joy, and
Yeah.
obviously it ends tragically. But
Yeah. Well, no, but it didn't end tragically. It ends sadly.
it ends sadly.
They got to leave the world on their own terms, and they
Yeah.
got to enjoy their lives before they did that.
Yeah.
So I think it's 5 for me. Scenario development.
Yeah. Cool. Next category is entertainment value.
5.
Yeah.
I mean, I gave it a 4, but I could go with a 5.
I'm just curious. Was there something about it that you were not impressed with, or
I don't
disappointed by?
necessarily think all of it was equally entertaining, necessarily. The Bill and Frank episode, I was like, do we have to be playing the piano? Like, why is this happening?
Here and I, Rob, were discussing about a beautiful moment.
But that's why.
Okay.
But if you guys want to give it a 5,
We can give it a 4.5, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you felt like there were slow parts that like just were not entertaining, like I could get that. There were some parts where I was later on where I was like, okay, like let's move on a bit. So I could see it. I could see it, but
We're gonna do 4.75.
no, not another one. Well, actually, it would round it up. No. We'll do a 4.5.
Okay.
Okay.
Surprise of the imagination or creativity. It's basically supposed to be the opposite of failure of imagination when it comes to these types of things. So I would give this a pretty high mark because fungus are not usually thought of very often as a potential threat.
Yeah, I think I would give it a 4, and I'm only dinging it because it is a story that's been told before to a certain extent. It's a scenario we've seen before,
right.
and I'm not going to try to suggest that
Just because it's a fungus, it's
yeah.
super different. I mean, it's a little bit different.
It's definitely different. It's telling a unique sort of story, but the scenario and the environment that it is using to tell the story is one we've seen many times before, and most notably, again, with The Walking Dead and some other properties that are out there. So, the imagination and the creativity is around the edges, and it's most specifically at the heart of the relationship between Joel and Ellie and those that they encounter along the way and what they see in terms of the various bonds of those individuals. So I think it's a 4 from a creativity perspective.
I give it a 3.
You give it a 3.
Yeah.
Not. You think it was especially. You thought it was so like run of the middle of the road.
I
in terms
thought,
of,
look,
creativity?
the only thing that was, to me, that was different, without having played the game, obviously, was that they used a fungus instead of a virus or a bacteria. Okay. So that's cool. But then after that, I don't know. I just didn't think, this is what happens. Like, what's so creative about it? It went, it flew around the world in a few days. Well, we think that could happen, so that's not creative. the relationship between these people, none of them were like super creative relationships. They're just relationships. Father and daughter, father and substitute daughter, brother and father. Like, I don't know. That's what I thought. So I'd say overall, let's give it a 4. Since you gave it a 5 and you gave it a 4 and I gave it a 3.
Okay. Sounds good. So the next category is shock or surprise value, and based off episode 1 alone, I'm inclined to give it a 5.
You thought it was very shocking and surprising?
So I did play the first episode, or the first mission of the first game, and got to that point, and it was shocking enough to where I stopped playing the game. So,
Oh, that kind of shock.
I mean, like it could be a shock or surprise or anything. It doesn't have to necessarily be like a clicker showing up or anything like that.
Okay, I'll
But
give you that.
did you expect Pedro Pascal's daughter to die in the first episode?
Of course I did.
Yeah, I did too. Because
Why do you played that game?
no, but even before when the game was coming out, I mean, it's
Well, because Ellie's on the cover.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's the easy thing. It's an easy thing when you're looking at a trailer for a movie or trailer for a game or advertising for any of these things. It's like, there's this person that seems really important, but they're not in any of the advertising materials for this product.
So I did not.
It's HBO too, I thought. But you have to have something super dramatic occur in the first. And also, she was too pure and
perfect,
too
yeah.
perfect,
Yeah.
and too amazing. I just thought, she's got a mark on her.
I mean, I do think,
She's gone somewhere.
I think the surprise for me, both playing through the game and then again watching the show, was that even the monsters, such as that they were understandable in their motivation, even if you didn't agree with them.
Yeah.
That you could kind of understand that there is humanity there.
They almost had some personality.
Yeah, really, Kathleen, who's by the way an entirely new character. The parts that play out in Kansas City are very different than the game, which actually takes place in Pittsburgh instead. That they wanted to introduce kind of a conflict between Henry and Sam, who are in the game, and an individual from that area. And so Kathleen is a new character. Melanie Lynskey is a fantastic actress, and I think she does a good job of conveying that she's crazy and evil, but also there's a reason for it, that she lost the most important person in the entire world to her, and as a result kind of lost it and couldn't see past the pain. And so it's always nice, and not necessarily a full, complete surprise, but always nice to see storytelling that goes to there. The decision by Joel to essentially sacrifice the entire rest of the world to save Ellie was a surprise, both going through the game, but also watching the show.
You're a dad. What wouldn't you do for your children?
It's funny. I think on the podcast for that episode, the producers said that every time they ask someone how they feel about the end of the game, I think the response, if they're a parent, the response is, "Oh yeah, I would have done the exact same thing." Overwhelmingly, they approve what Joel did because they put themselves in that.
I think human beings do stuff like that all the time.
Yeah,
it's not 100% rational.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
it's a common storyline. We just one of our podcasts that we've recorded, I don't think we've released, is on one of the Star Trek movies, where they're talking about the good of the many and the good of the one, and all of that, and what happens in the end. Spock, of all people, sacrifices for one person, whereas Kirk is the opposite, right? He sacrifices. So it's not. I don't think it's as unrealistic.
But it was shocking to you personally.
It was a little shocking to me, only because you would expect at the end of a story like that,
with someone like Joel, who is kind of very, I don't know, headstrong.
Yeah.
And is very practical and is I'm in this survival mode.
Yeah, and to be clear, they do a good job of building the story so that it's understandable by the time he reaches that decision point, why he's doing what he's doing. I think they do a good job there. But, normally in a story like this, you would expect that the goal would be to find a cure for the disease and the good guys win and they cure the world and everything like that. Now, maybe we're just so jaded because we've seen so many of these movies and shows now where that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But it's still somewhat surprising when that solution is presented to you and the individual walks away from it. Or in this case, shoots it in the face.
Okay, so what are we saying? What numbers are we giving?
I don't know what are you feeling?
I mean, based on the first episode alone, I was willing to give it a 5.
Okay. What about you, Rob?
I was leaning towards a 3.5 or a 4.
Yeah, I gave it a 4.
Okay, so are we going to do a 4 or a 3.5 or 3.75?
I'd say 4.
4, yeah, 4 cuts in the middle. Yeah, because 3, 4, 5. So yeah, okay, 4. Next one is government policy.
I gave it a 1.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I should ask for clarification. When we say government policy, what are we talking about here?
How effective the government
Whatever counts for government,
for government in these situations.
In this situation.
Well, I think the government was pretty, I'm not going to say inept, but ineffective, let's put it that way, with regard to stemming the outbreak and apparently only being able to save a few quarantine zones, which have then proceeded to fall over time. I think 1 is probably
Yeah, I think so too. That's what I would have given it. Okay, so that's a 1. Portrayal by the actors. This is so coming back to the scientific accuracy conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I give them a 5.
I gave it a 5.
Yeah, same.
Okay, same.
No
nobody.
Yeah.
No points. Like
No notes.
no notes. Yeah, like that. Everyone in this did amazing.
Yeah.
There was not anybody that was slacking or lacking or that did not feel like a real character. So with that, direction is the next.
I gave that a 5. I thought the way these people were directed in every single scene where it wasn't, playing the piano and that kind of thing, their ability to create tension, even though you know what's going to happen or you can predict what's going to happen, you're still tense about it.
Right.
That is, I think that falls squarely on the director. Whatever they were doing, whatever they directed people to do, it was great every single time.
Yeah. I completely agree. You feel the tension throughout the whole series, even when there's nothing immediately apparent, like in the mall in episode 7, where you're just waiting for something
to happen. You're like,
the whole time. No, I couldn't agree more. And for me, and this is partially because it's done slightly different than the game, but in that lodge in episode 8, when Ellie proceeds to just absolutely brutalize that man to death, David. What actually struck me about the direction was the proximity, how close she is to the camera, and that there's blood on the lens as she's hacking away. And I just, I was watching it last night, and I just, it really was striking. Yeah. Because that was different than what they did in the game. So I'd say 5.
All right, 5 it is. Next one is production. I'm also saying we should give this a 5. I think the clickers and all the infected looked amazing. I think after showing you guys that video, what the insect form of cordyceps looks like, I think it was pretty damn accurate for what it would look like in a human, probably.
I do think they, in my opinion, if we included it in production, I did think they kind of wimped out a little bit in that they should have set this in 2033, right? And instead they decided, let's set it in 2023. Yeah. Because then we don't have to worry about what cars look like and what this looks like and like that. Yeah. So that's a production decision.
Right. Because
not a direction decision.
Well, actually, to be honest, they would have been better off setting it in 2043. And because when you think about it, society ceased.
In 2003, yes.
It stopped after the outbreak day. They didn't make any new cars. They didn't make any new phones. So if you really want to save on production costs, you started it right now, and then you projected 20 years in the future because it's just the same. Okay. I think it would have been a good way to
so again, not very production.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
A production decision.
It's a fascinating decision. I'd be curious to hear more about why they decided to do that specifically. But the only
maybe it had to do with the music. I know that was a consideration for this series.
Perhaps it's something to do with the music. Perhaps it was the feeling that the planet would be further warmed within 10 to 20 years, that you could make an argument about
cordyceps dying.
Yeah.
Cordyceps either dying off or being worse. Yeah.
So what do you think, Brian?
The scene where the infected burst out of the ground in Kansas City, half of those were CGI, but did you notice that? It was Weta. Weta Workshop did the work on that, apparently. The scene in the mall, a good portion of that was CG. Would not have known.
So
did you see the behind the scenes stuff where they showed like the bloater?
Yeah.
And that one scene with all the fire, that was a real person.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know. It was beautiful.
I can't give it a 5 because I would give it if we're going with our quarter point system,
A quarter point.
let's give it a 4.75. I can't give it a 5.
Okay, well, let's do 4.5. I'll do 4.5.
We'll do
4.5.
We'll do
Okay,
4.5.
4.5.
We'll do 4.5 because I think they did a lot of good jobs, a lot of good things there. Clearly, they were very budget conscious in some areas. I think the fact that you only see infected up through about the first half or through two-thirds of the show, and then the last 2 episodes you don't even see infected really at all.
Yeah.
I think that was partially a budget decision, and that's okay.
That's fine.
I think it's fantastic that they were able to make the clickers through practical effects. I think that was really cool. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last is writing, and I know a lot of this comes back to the game itself because
some of the lines are lifted directly from the game.
Directly from the game.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Ron. What do you think? Do you think it's the best written game of all time? That's what I've heard.
Or the best written show.
That is a very charged statement, and I don't know if I'm prepared to say that quite yet. What I will say, it is probably one of the most thoughtful, most thoughtfully plotted and written and characterized shows and games that I've seen in a while. And I think it's absolutely, of course, I'm not thinking of any of its competition in this moment, but I think if it's not the best video game adaptation as a show, it's up there.
I think it's definitely the best.
And I think it could have only been adapted as a show. They were originally talking about making it as a movie about 10 years ago, and I think it would not have had the breathing room that it truly needed to develop the relationship between these two characters. I mean, even setting aside that a lot of the writing came from the game, I still say it's a 4 or 4.5 minimum for me. Yeah, I would probably say at least a 4.5.
And I think it's hard to adapt a game. How many shows have we seen that are based on games that are just tragically awful because it's a very different medium from when you're playing a game to when you're viewing it on screen. It's a completely different experience.
Yeah.
I don't think even though I've only played the first episode, the first mission of The Last of Us, and then watched the show, I can tell from the community that it was, and from the things that, you said that it was extremely faithful to the game, and I don't think we've had that for any other video game. So I don't know.
Not to this
extent.
To the point that you've got one of the executive producers, both of the executive producers, basically saying we're just going to recreate this scene
verbatim
in the show, and again and again and again. And while I think they also did a great job writing new scenes like the Bill and Frank episode. So I give credit to that as well. They found ways to further build upon what was already there
without retconning or doing anything.
I gave it a 4.
Okay.
What did you give?
I was going to say 4.5.
I think that, the first cold open with John Hannah is an entirely new scene, I should note, as is the Jakarta scene.
Yeah, but I think that if you're lifting stuff from somewhere else, that's not...
That's fair.
It's not to say that the game wasn't good writing.
Yeah. But it is not entirely
original content.
But which would you rather have? Would you rather have the writers coming along and saying, we're going to do our own thing and change it up completely and basically bastardize it?
That's why I'm giving it a 4.
The 4 is still... I could do 4.
4.25. Final offer.
Okay, let's do 4.25. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, so that gives us an overall average rating of about 4.18.
Wow.
Which is one of the highest rated.
Yeah. I think it's strong overall. I think aside from the government policy piece,
right?
And I think that's demonstrated in the average score, and I think that's a fair score.
But to have a 1 on there and still get above a 4 is pretty impressive.
And something that we didn't really talk about at the beginning of this is that the reason why we're doing the podcast for this show now is that the second season of The Last of Us is coming out imminently. To when this podcast is released, and we wanted to take a look back at this season of the show and at the first game in advance of the release of the second season, which hopefully we'll be reconvening to discuss and see how it influences our thinking about the first game in the first season after we had a chance to look at it and review it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely excited for the next season, and we'll definitely be covering it on the podcast. I think that's in April. right?
Yeah, they believe, yeah.
April,
which could be very close to when this episode is dropping, depending on
depending on timelines. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Rob, for returning, and we hope to have you again more frequently.
Yeah, happy to, anytime.
And as we close out, just want to remind everybody, when you're lost in the darkness, look for the light.
Look for the light, the HBO light.